Time Radio. That's right, Dan Watson sitting in tonight for Jay Zimbauer. You've heard my voice before on here. I'm sure by now Jay has bagged a couple of elk somewhere up in the far north in cooler weathers and all kinds of hunting. Because if you don't know Jay Zimbauer, if there's hunting or fishing to be done, well, and he can get there, he's on the move. So Jay loves those things in the outdoors, and we've heard a rumor he'll be back here next week. As long as the trout don't start running somewhere in a northern stream. So anyway, in this show, usually we're taking phone calls, and I'm an oil specialist, certified lubrication specialist. And so if you got a call, certainly give me a call. Numbers here, 407-674-1025, or toll free 855-545-1025, and I'll take those calls. I want to start out tonight with a little bit of commentary because of certain things in the news, and my business is oil and lubes and those kind of things, so I have some interest in that area and got some comments to make and thought it'd be just a fine time to do it. Today, as most people that pay attention to the news, you would see that the subject of the Keystone XL pipeline came up again, and as usual, it was portrayed as some type of ugly apparatus that's going to ruin the countryside and darken the planet. Now, the politicians just play it like some type of a tetherball or something. They knock it around the pole back and forth as they see fit when they think it'll give them some advantage for votes. And that's politics, so we know that, so there's no reason to cry in our beer about it. That's just the way it is. But why don't we take a look at this pipeline, where it's coming from, what it's doing, and ask ourselves, are we making a real conscious, serious decision here, or are we just kicking something around and not paying attention to what the real facts are? Now, let me stipulate up front, so that I'm completely honest, that I'm not a person who follows that the climate change or global warming is a result entirely of man-made activities. One would be foolish to say that there's no change in the climate. That would have to be some kind of ostrich. All we'd see is the feathers sticking up from his tail end. Wouldn't have any idea what's going on. Of course the climate changes. Let me just give you a couple examples. My wife is from Chicago, okay? Beautiful city. I love to go to Chicago. There's this big lake there, Lake Michigan, right next to it. And then when I go up to the AMSOIL headquarters in Duluth, Minnesota, my God, there's this other giant lake, Lake Superior. I don't know how many people really know or understand that the Great Lakes are the remnants of the glacier ice sheet that set that far down into North America and had ice as high as 2 miles high that depressed those gouged out sections in the ground due to the weight of the ice. Now, 20,000 years ago, the planet began to warm out of that ice age, and those things melted. They're gone. Now, I would call that a fairly significant climate change, that what was North America covered with 2 miles of ice, Hudson Bay is the remnant of the ice sheet, and every year, all of the land in central Canada rises 3 to 4 inches, still trying to get the depression from the weight of that ice for it to return to normal. The ground was depressed due to the weight of that ice. It's all gone. Now, I submit to you that somewhere 20,000 years ago, that man barbecuing his mastodon on the edge of the ice sheet was not responsible for the warming that took place to melt the glaciers and melt the ice sheet. So let's be realistic here. The planet undergoes significant dynamic changes, and it doesn't give a hoot what we're doing. It's going to make its changes one way or the other. So now that's me stipulating where I stand on man-made global warming. Nobody denies that we have climate change. The trick is that when people try to say it's entirely man-made, that's just, I wish we were that powerful and we could fix things like that. We just don't seem to be. The planet has a history of its own, a long history, a few billion years before we had even showed up on the scene. And it was changing from ice ball to hot planet back and forth. So anyway, I'll get off that subject and get to the pipeline. So even if you agree with man-made global warming and you're concerned about these hydrocarbons coming out of Canada, the pipeline doesn't make any difference. Right now, by rail, we're moving 500,000 barrels a day of oil from Canada into the United States via railways. Now, so that you understand that, each rail car, tanker car, carries 1,000 barrels. So that takes 500 cars making it down the tracks into the United States on a daily basis, and there's probably 500 empty ones headed back. So we got this exchange going on. You got to know this. They've exhausted about all of the current certified tanker cars that they can use, both there and in the South Dakota Bakken oil field where they're having to do the same thing. So what's going on right now is there is a building program as fast as they can build new tanker cars. Now, if they don't approve this pipeline, within a year or two, we'll be up to 1 million barrels a day on rail coming in and out of Canada, okay? So the pipeline only provides a more economical, safe way to move the oil that is going to be moved regardless. So when you look at denying the building of the pipeline, you go, well, what are you accomplishing here? Maybe a political move, but you're not accomplishing anything actually towards anything to do with the perceived global warming. Not a single thing. Now, it does accomplish something, which I will tell you, and it is political, and it's not good, but it accomplishes something. It irritates the Canadians big time because they need to move that oil. You see, Alberta holds, by some estimates, 1 trillion barrels of recoverable oil, the largest reserve in the world in one place. Now, the Canadians feel like this is a national asset that they have to develop for Canada to be live, healthy, and prosperous. So they're going to do it. The only thing it does to them when we do something as silly as deny this pipeline is it irritates them. So what do they decide then? You know, they offered that they would this would be exclusive to us. This would be like a North American, USA, located field. They would just let us develop it, and with our companies and some Canadian companies, and all that oil would come south, and we would have this dependable source of oil that nobody else could touch. Well, since we decided we don't want to play that game, they now are moving to build a pipeline through British Columbia to the coast where they can put it in tankers and send it to China. Now, remember, when it was just going to come south and we were the only customer, we're actually getting it at a discount. Sometimes as much as $10, $15, $20 a barrel discount. But when it goes to China and the Chinese are willing to pay for it, the discount's gone. So that means, and who suffers if the discount's gone? Who goes to the pump to buy gasoline? Who has to buy plastics that are made from that oil? It's us, the consumer. We're the ones that suffer, not the Canadians. They're going to sell it one way or the other. There is an existing pipeline that runs all the way to Nova Scotia, a deep water port where tankers come in. They don't do much there, but they're changing the pipeline. They're converting this existing 24-inch pipeline to an oil pipeline, and it will connect to the Alberta oil fields, and they will pump oil from Alberta all the way to Nova Scotia, load tankers, and send those tankers where? Well, right over to Europe, so that the Europeans can process that oil. So that what? The Europeans won't have to buy finished gasoline, diesel, and other products from our Gulf-based refineries, which are huge exporters of those products. If the pipeline went south, then we would get to refine that product and sell the finished product to the Europeans rather than the oil going directly to the European manufacturers. So this is an economic blunder. It makes no sense in economics. It will have no impact on perceived global warming whatsoever, okay? So there's no real plus to denying this pipeline, except maybe in some type of pandering to votes in the environmentalist groups that take this on and believe that they're accomplishing something. But, folks, sometimes when we see this stuff in the news, we have to back up and say, does any of this make any sense? What's the underlying factor here? The underlying factor is purely political. It makes no sense economically, makes no sense financially, and makes no sense environmentally. So, all right, we're up against the break, and, of course, you can always call up and tell me that I'm dumber than a box of rocks if you want to. But that's my commentary so far on the pipeline. And again, give us a call in here at 407-674-1025 or toll free 855-545-1025. We'll be back right after these messages. And welcome back to Car Time Radio. Dan Watson sitting in today for Jay Zimbauer. I am a certified lubrication specialist and would be glad to get your questions about lubrication. Speaking of that, we got Jonathan on the line. And Jonathan, how long do you think it's been since this vehicle had an oil change?
Now you're going to embarrass me. Probably 25 to 30,000 miles.
All right. And have you been able to check the oil and see if the levels are up where they should be?
Oh, no, the levels are great, and the oil looks good. Let me add another problem. It's a diesel, but it has had full synthetic, top name brand, full synthetic in it all the time.
Well, that would not be a significant problem for a diesel. I'm assuming if it's like one of the pickups, it's either got, 10, 12, 14, 16 quarts of oil. Is it one of the, like a Power Stroke diesel or a Cummins or one of those?
Yeah, it's a Ford 6.0, and it's 17 quarts. Right?
Yeah, okay, plenty of oil. And the synthetic oil that you're using in it, is it one that's that claims an extended oil drain or just normal drains?
That's a good question. I don't know. It's the Deep Blue Valvoline product.
Okay, it's what they call the premium blue. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that oil is designed for normal cases in a diesel about 15,000 miles. Now, that's probably underrated. Probably go longer than that. And if you haven't starting to see significant oil consumption, it means the oil hasn't gotten so dirty it's starting to have trouble. What I would say is it's time to change it. If you're at 25,000 miles, a couple of years, you should always try to change that oil at least annually. And if it's premium blue, annually or 15,000 miles, because that's what they recommend it for. And the reason you stick with the annual recommendation is because oil tends to collect a lot of moisture, and that moisture contributes to acidification, and you start to knock down what's called your alkalinity of the oil. And if it becomes acidic in nature, then it can start to work the surface off the bearings. So you want to go ahead and make sure that it's out of there. You might even consider running a quality engine flush at this particular change because it's been in there quite so long. And then I don't think you have any problem except to load her up again and keep going. Diesels with the right oils always run longer oil change intervals because you're running 4 gallons of oil in there. You know, that same size a gasoline engine would be running maybe 6, 7 quarts of oil. So you've got quite a reserve of additive package and things to work with. And the only problem you can run into with diesels is you get quite a bit of soot buildup. And you could be now running around with a 50-weight oil or higher, maybe even a 60-weight oil in the engine because of the soot content, which will thicken the oil. So it's definitely time to get it out of there. And because when that oil gets too thick, the first problem you run into is it's going to have a little trouble taking care of your turbo. You want that oil to be able to flow quickly and evenly through that turbo. And when it starts to get too thick, it can start to slow down the flow rate through that turbo, and that oil can get super hot before it can get through that turbo.
You know, I hadn't thought about that. That makes great logical sense because there's so many quarts in there. It can go longer than with less quarts. That's great. The other thing about this particular vehicle, they have that EGR cooler, and they're prone to plugging up. Now, you mentioned a flush.
Right.
And I looked, and I don't know which one, but the other thought you read on the web about using the seafoam. And I had the thought about putting some seafoam in with the old oil, run it for a little bit, and then drain it all out and put all fresh.
Seafoam is a good product. Just make sure that when you get it, that it actually has on its label the mixture rate they want you to use and that it says that it's compatible and okay for diesel engines, okay? I think it should.
Right.
But just make sure it says that, and Seafoam makes a good flush. There are some out there, and I'm glad you mentioned that, the Seafoam, because I don't usually mention them by name. Seafoam's a good trustable flush. There are some out there that are so caustic, so abrasive, that they will actually do damage to seals in the engine before you can get them through in a flush.
Right. But so you don't see a problem with putting Seafoam in there and run it for a while and then change it?
Well, what you want to do with any of these flushes, and say run it for a while, most of the time you're better off if you're able to keep the truck at a high idle, like 1,000, 1,200 RPM, and not drive it under load. Just let that stuff circulate while you're idling in the driveway, so to speak, because when you go out and load the truck, any of the flushes can kind of defeat some of the lubrication quality under heavy load in the bearings, and you don't want to have a breakdown of the oil there due to the flush that's mingled with the oil. So it's better to run it under light load at a high RPM for maybe 30 minutes and then drain it out.
Okay, one last thing. The filters get plugged up and they go to the bypass, but we're thinking that the oil hadn't gotten that bad yet.
Well, it doesn't sound like it since you said you looked at it. Now, one thing you'd be able to know is if you take a pure white napkin, take your dipstick out and let it put a couple of drops right in the same place, and then let that set for a minute and see if the stain is all the same color, or if the stain is a lighter brown on the inside and forms a dark ring on the outside. If it does that, that means the soot levels are high enough to be carried with the oil until it loses the oil as a carrier right at the end of the stain. Then you have this black circle all the way around. That means you got some pretty high soot, and it's really got to get that guy out of there. Now, these turbocharged engines like the one you got, they do burn really efficiently, but the problem is they have EGR systems to try to control nitrous oxide to cool the cylinder down, and they're taking exhaust and kicking it back into the engine, and that exhaust brings that soot right back with it. So it's a way to soot pack the oil, and it's unfortunate that that's what it does. So that's one of the reasons why the annual change, you got to be careful and not let soot levels get too high.
Outstanding. Great information, my friend. Thank you very much.
All right, good call. Diesels are here to stay, folks. I talked about them last week, and you might have thought I was being a little bit critical on the diesel situation, but I'm not. Diesel technology should be used way more here than it is. In Europe, 60% of all the vehicles on the road are diesel vehicles because they get better fuel economy, they last longer. The only problem had always been is that they would stink and rattle like the devil. Well, that's not the case in a modern turbocharged diesel. It doesn't rattle, and it burns so efficiently that it doesn't stink. So it's called clean diesel technology, and it's outstanding technology. Now, when I talked in the first commentary section there about Canadian oil, I was asked a question about why do they call it dirty oil from Canada? Well, that's because in the world of petroleum, you have what's called light sweet crude, you have heavy crude, and you have dirty crude. Now, they use those terms, and they all know what they're talking about. But don't think for a minute that it means that because this oil is dirty, somehow that it's a bigger dirty polluter or something. What it means is that light sweet crude, when I bring it out of the ground, it's a terrifically lightweight oil that goes right into the refinery and is easy to refine, and you're done with it. You can make all kind of stuff. Heavy crude is the same kind of liquid oil. It's not so bad with impurities, but it's just a heavier cut. Sometimes you have things called asphaltic oil versus paraffinic oil, okay? Now, but what the Canadian oil is actually called bitumen. Bitumen is where the hydrocarbons are stuck in sand and grit, and you have to separate this stuff as a slurry, and then even when you get that separated and you start getting the sand and all that out of it, then it is still a harder to crack molecular structure than the other oils. Now, this is common in the tar sands, and you hear I said the word tar, right? Because bitumen is more like tar than like liquid. Now, out of Venezuela, they also have bitumen. It's under that huge lake right in the top section. I forget the name of it. It's not Lake Maracaibo. Anyway, it's that big lake in the top. They actually have oil wells out in the middle of this thing. But they have to pump this stuff out of the ground from a couple thousand feet down, where in Canada, they're basically mining it. They dig it up in these huge, gigantic Tonka truck-looking things and haul it in, and they have a processing method that they use to actually clean it up. And then, in order to put it in a pipeline, you have to actually cut it in order to get it to flow, because you can't pump tar, okay? So anyway, it's a more expensive method to do, and it takes refineries that are capable of refining that heavy weight oil. Guess what? Almost all of our Gulf Coast refineries are set up to refine that. They can do it. No problem at all, okay? So it's not dirty in the aspect that when you're done with it and you make gasoline out of it, the gasoline is more polluting because you made it from bitumen than you made it from light sweet crude. It's just that it's harder to process, okay? So much for the dirty, but, you know, if you get the people on the left, they like to call it dirty because anything that contributes hydrocarbons to the world is dirty, just nasty stuff, right? Okay, we're up against another break here. We're going to take a break, pay some bills, and we'll be back in a few minutes. And welcome back to Car Time Radio. Dan Watson sitting in for Jay Zimbauer today. I'm a certified lubrication specialist from the STLE and answering questions about lubrication, oil products, what's good for your car. Had a good question on a diesel earlier. Today I've been more involved in sort of commentary, talking about the XL pipeline, Keystone XL pipeline, and Canadian oil. I want to finish up a statement on that, and then I was asked during the break to describe fracking and what's going on with fracking, because maybe people don't understand exactly what that is. But I did want to let you know that the Canadian production of oil, about 2 million barrels a day, okay? That's a lot of oil. But did you know that they are shooting for 4 million barrels a day? Now, what does that mean to us? Why do we, hey, okay, you're going to make 2 million, you're going to do 4 million, what are you going to do? World oil production and world oil demand will control the price of oil, which will then control the price of gasoline and diesel and affect our everyday lives. Okay, that's why it's important. Now, if you remember about 7 years ago, there were people who just poo-pooed the idea that drilling could make any difference. They called people that call for more production silly dreamers that had no idea about how the world market works. Now, those other people had a slogan they coined, which was, drill, baby, drill. If we drill enough oil, it'll make a difference, right? Well, guess what? They went out, and despite the government trying to stop them from drilling, it's all on private land. Don't let anybody tell you that the federal government of the United States has assisted with the increased oil production in this country. It's almost all on private land. And they went out and they began to use a process called fracking. And they discovered things like, well, wait a minute, the Permian oil basin in Texas is not really out of oil. If you go in and use fracking techniques, there's more oil in the ground than they took out before. Tons and tons and tons of oil. And how do you do it? Well, fracking means that I have to use some source of high-pressure liquid from the surface down the well, and I do what's called horizontal boring. See, this is the thing that made it possible. I go down the oil well, and I use a boring machine that ends up going sideways, and that horizontal bore, we make several roots out from the bottom, like a tree almost, parallel, going out horizontally. I can use high-pressure water or high-pressure fluid in each one of those channels, and I create enough pressure, pulse pressure, to crack the rock structure. And when I crack the rock structure, it releases the oil that couldn't come out due to being trapped in the porous rock. So all of a sudden, I've given it a path, and it's under pressure, and it begins to move towards the opening which I created for it. And now I've got all this residual oil. See, all we could take out with a vertical hole before was whatever had pooled, whatever itself had found a place to actually collect as a liquid. If you can imagine, thinking for just a moment, that I've got a strata of rock, and you're looking at it on a picture, and it bows up in the middle and goes down, kind of like a U-shaped curve, the old bell curve we talk about, right? Well, at the top of that, the oil squeezes up and puddles. But once I pump all that out, I've got all the oil that puddled naturally in that rise. But all the rest of the oil that was in the rock that couldn't get out to squeeze up to puddle is still there. So in many oil fields that were vertically pumped, using fracking, we find that 75% of the oil is still there. We only were able to get maybe 25% out with vertical drilling. So all of these so-called spent fields are opened up again. My daughter worked for Shell Oil Company for a while and was in West Texas, and what they had determined a long time ago was dead. They're fracking out there at a rate that was unbelievable, just reopening wells, fracking them, and pumping out oil. Now, it costs money to do that, make no doubt about it. And to do it safely, you have to follow all the environmental rules so that you don't screw things up, and that costs money. So if the price of oil per barrel drops below $40 a barrel, most of the fracking is going to stop, because you can't go out there and invest money in fracking a well that you can't recover your cost and make some money off of it. That would just be detrimental to the health of the company that's involved in producing the oil. So they're not going to do that. However, worldwide market peaked at use of about 80 million barrels a day. Production peaked at about 80 million barrels a day. Now the demand, due to worldwide conditions, has dropped off maybe to 76, 77 million barrels a day. But because of U.S. drilling production, primarily, the available oil to actually put on the world market exceeds 80 million barrels, but there's no place to use it. So it's called a glut of oil. And what happens in a free market system when there's too much of a product? The price goes down. Now, in the past, what would happen? OPEC, a group of organization of petroleum exporting countries, right, in the Middle East and around the world, they'd cut back on production to get that glut down so they could hold the prices up. Problem is today, they don't have that much cooperation and organizational strength. So what do? They fight with each other, and they're so dependent upon the oil revenue. Instead of actually cutting back on production, some are increasing production to try to make as much money off of a cheaper barrel than they were making off of the higher price, and they're putting more of a glut of oil on the market. So they're just forcing the prices down further. What will happen is what always happens. Eventually, somebody is going to go under, so to speak, and they're going to start capping off wells, and they're going to get the production down. And it'll be a seesaw up and down until it reaches a new benchmark or base mark. Now, many people predict that will be different prices, but most of the experts predict it'll settle in somewhere around $55 to $60 a barrel eventually as a long-term base mark. Might be a little above, a little below, but that's where it's going to settle. Listen, part of the reason for that is understand, off the coast of Brazil, in 12,000 foot of water, there's one of the largest oil reserves ever been discovered in the world. But you have to go down 12,000 feet, then you have to penetrate 2,500 feet of rock, then you have to go through 5,000 feet of liquid salt, and then hit another rock base and go about another 2,000 feet, and you're into the mother lode. It is so much oil, it's hard to even describe. But the cost of that one well to get down to that level is $2 billion. Now, you got to pump some oil at a decent price to recover your $2 billion effort to get the first well down. And the oil well that was drilled in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico was at 5,500 feet, and that was considered to be exceptionally just an engineering marvel to be able to drill that well, the one that had the leak. So what do you think it's like to go down 12,000 feet before you get to the bottom of the ocean? You know what the pressures are, the water pressures at 12,000 feet? They're unimaginable. I can tell you, I'm a retired Navy submariner. They're unimaginable at 12,000 feet. So whatever machinery you got operating, trying to function on the bottom of the ocean at 12,000 feet, it's just unbelievable, the engineering, technology that it takes to do this. So anyway, up against a break again, and we'll pay some bills. We'll be back, and I'll finish up my commentary today. And welcome back to Car Time Radio. I know I've been a little off the beaten path today with some commentary on some different things, but I don't hear the information being put out, and this is an area that I am an expert in, and I get frustrated seeing low-knowledge politicians talk about things that they don't understand, and they're actually accepted that what they say makes sense, when most of the time what you find out is what they say is trying to make political sense but has no technological basis to it whatsoever. It's almost embarrassing sometimes to watch it, listen to it, and realize that it's almost that old saying, the inmates are running the asylum, because if you're looking to get something done in these highly technological areas and the things that are going on, you'd like to think that we could find somebody with some knowledge in that area to be in charge. In other words, at least we could get an energy secretary or interior secretary that would be up through the ranks and could say, hey, this guy's an expert in energy. You know why? Because he's been out there producing it, not because he's a lawyer who happened to sue people, over in the New York court on whether or not they were using the right plastics or whatever, So it'd be nice to once in a while see us try to use people who know something. My military experience in the Navy is that you should actually go through a series of steps before they give you to be the captain of the ship. In other words, they don't go out and find a guy on the dock and say, hey, bud, come over here. We're going to make you captain of the ship. You actually have some things to do and accomplish before they give you the keys. Unfortunately, in the political realm, sometimes we give the guy the keys and he doesn't even know where the car is, much less where to use the key. So anyway, that's a pet peeve of mine when it comes to technological aspects of our society. Okay. Now, when talking about this, let me finish up this with the thing that comes down to production of energy. I was talking about a worldwide market for oil. Well, there is a worldwide market. And every day out there, somebody is opening up another oil well, or somebody is producing another million vehicles, or building another million houses, and all these things take energy. And there's a big demand for energy in the world. And people would say, well, this is the problem that we got, is that all this technology and all this energy, and we're just destroying the planet with it, right? Well, let me submit to you, with 6 billion people on the planet, if it were not for technology, this planet would look like a huge wooden ball impacted by termites is what it would look like. Because, I'll give you an example. Wonderful, big, gigantic island off the coast of Africa. Used to be called Madagascar. Sometimes it's called Malagasy now. But whatever you want to call it, beautiful island. Had a rainforest, a big, giant rainforest right down the middle of the island in the mountains. It's all gone. The reason it's gone is because the population had to have fuel. They had to have stuff to burn in their wood stoves and to live on. So they used what was available, wood, trees. They cut them down. Okay, now, if every one of those people had a small gas-fired cook stove and hadn't had to cut down a single tree, do you think that the environment of the world would be better off if the Malagasy rainforest was still there because we use natural gas cook stoves instead of using wood to cook on? So my point is, if you go around the world and you see areas, you go into New York or Chicago, gigantic cities, right? Can you imagine those cities without electricity, that we're trying to haul wood in every day or coal to stick in stoves so as we can cook? And it's just crazy. So technology has actually allowed greater numbers of human beings to impact the environment less per capita than anything else that goes on. So a true environmentalist would be just absolutely ecstatic every time a new piece of technology came down the road that said, we're going to be able to do this with less impact on the overall environment because of this new technology. But instead, most environmentalists think that we all should go back out into the woods, live in cabins, and all sing Kumbaya as we go out picking flowers. Now, it doesn't work that way, and it takes massive amounts of energy to support a modern economy. And that massive amount of energy that's produced allows us to live in concert on this planet. And we have to recognize that. Look at all of the countries that are poor without good sources of good energy. They are impacting their environment at multitudes compared to what we do or what the British do or what the Germans do. And it's because this high tech we have allows us to live in concentrations. Can you even imagine how the technology that has gone to deal with sewage? I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, a few million people create some sewage. Well, only through modern technology, we actually discharge water that in some cases is cleaner than the groundwater coming out of the well because of the technology that we've developed. So anyway, I'm raving about technology because I am so tired of seeing what I call the intellectually dishonest approach to the environment. The true approach is that whatever I can do to lessen the impact of the human footprint is fine. And it's usually technology that allows me to make those leaps and bounds rather than denying technology. So as we advance forward, we can do numerous things to clean up our air. Did you know that the modern turbo diesel produced by either Ford, Chevy, or Dodge, if it's driving around in Bay City, Texas, they ought to pay those guys for being air cleaners because the air that comes out the exhaust is cleaner than what goes in the intake of that engine. So marvelous technological leaps, marvelous things that happen. We need to appreciate them and encourage those scientists and those engineers to just keep on trucking and to continue to develop those things which give us great ability to live our lives and live them successfully with little impact and to actually maybe be happy. Okay, that'd be all right. We could live a little being happy, not sit around and beat ourselves with a wet hose about how bad we are on the planet. Okay, so anyway, I've had my rave for the day. It's been fun. And I imagine when Jay gets back, he's going to question whether or not I ought to come back in here with these kind of ravings. But I just had to do it. Once in a while you get frustrated, you got to let it rip. So, hey, listen, I'll be back in a couple of weeks, the first Wednesday of next month, and I'll look forward to taking your questions and seeing you then. So, till then.